Chapter 4, Part 1 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill. Admirals All. Concerning brave captains our age hath made known. Rudyard Kipling. At the Admiralty, the state of business, immediate measures, the two leading sailors, Lord Fisher of Kilverstone, his great reforms, his violent methods, the schism in the fleet, difficulties of his task, the Bacon letters, our conference at Reigate Priory, a fateful decision, Lord Fisher's correspondence, Sir Arthur Wilson, the First Sea Lord, deadlock concerning the war staff policy, formation of a new Board of Admiralty, the command of the home fleets, Sir Arthur Wilson's retirement, a digression forward, Captain Pakenham's seagoing record, Rear Admiral Beatty, the Naval Secretary, Prince Louis of Battenberg becomes Second Sea Lord, the War Staff, military education and staff training, captains of ships and captains of war, 15 years and only 30 months. Mr. McKenna and I changed guard with strict punctilio. In the morning he came over to the Home Office, and I introduced him to the officials there. In the afternoon I went over to the Admiralty. He presented his board and principal officers and departmental heads to me, and then took his leave. I knew he felt greatly his change of office, but no one would have divined it from his manner. As soon as he had gone, I convened a formal meeting of the board, at which the secretary read the new letters patent constituting me its head, and I thereupon, in the words of the Order in Council, became, quote, responsible to Crown and Parliament for all the business of the Admiralty, end quote. I was to endeavor to discharge this responsibility for the 4 most memorable years of my life. The state of Admiralty business was as follows. The estimates and plans for the financial year 1912-13 were far advanced. The program had been settled, and the designs of the vessels only awaited final approval. We were to lay down 3 battleships, 1 battle cruiser, 2 light cruisers, Dartmouths, 1 smaller light cruiser, a Blonde, the usual flotilla of 20 destroyers, and a number of submarines and ancillary craft. The estimates embodying this policy had to be passed by the Cabinet at the latest by the end of February and presented to the House of Commons in the utmost detail in March. But a great uncertainty hung over all these plans. A continued succession of rumors and reports from many sources, and of hints and allusions in the German press, foreshadowed a further German naval increase. This, following upon all that had gone before and coming at a moment when relations were so tense, must certainly aggravate the situation. It would inevitably compel us to make important additional countermeasures. What these countermeasures would have to be could not be decided till the text of the new German Navy law was known to us. It was clear, however, from the information received, that it was not only to be an increase in new construction, but in the number of squadrons or vessels maintained in a state of instant and constant readiness. In addition to these complications were a number of naval questions of prime importance which I conceived required new treatment. First, the war plans of the fleet, which up to that moment had been based upon the principle of close blockade. Second, the organization of the fleets with a view to increasing their instantly ready strength. Third, measures to guard against all aspects of surprise in the event of a sudden attack. Fourth, the formation of a naval war staff. Fifth, the concerting of the war plans of the Navy and the Army by close cooperation of the 2 departments. Sixth, further developments in design to increase the gun power of our new ships in all classes. Seventh, changes in the high commands of the fleet and in the composition of the Board of Admiralty. To all these matters I addressed myself in constant secret consultations with the principal persons concerned in each. For the present, however, I arrived at no important decisions, but labored continually to check and correct the opinions with which I had arrived at the Admiralty by the expert information which on every subject was now at my disposal. With the agreement of the Sea Lords, I gave certain directions on minor points immediately. The flotilla of destroyers sanctioned in the 1911-12 estimates would not have been let out to contract till the very end of the financial year. We now accelerated these 20 boats, the L's, by 4 months, and thus, though we could not possibly foresee it, they were almost all fully commissioned just in time for the great review and mobilization of the fleet which preceded the outbreak of war. I gave, moreover, certain personal directions to enable me to sleep quietly in my bed. The naval magazines were to be effectively guarded under the direct charge of the Admiralty. The continuous attendance of naval officers, additional to that of the resident clerks, was provided at the Admiralty, so that at any hour of the day or night, weekdays, Sundays, or holidays, there would never be a moment lost in giving the alarm, and one of the Sea Lords was always to be on duty in or near the Admiralty building to receive it. Upon the wall behind my chair I had an open case fitted, within whose folding doors spread a large chart of the North Sea. On this chart every day a staff officer marked with flags the position of the German fleet. Never once was this ceremony omitted until the war broke out and the great maps, covering the whole of one side of the war room, began to function. I made a rule to look at my chart once every day when I first entered my room. I did this less to keep myself informed, for there were many other channels of information, than in order to inculcate in myself and those working with me a sense of ever-present danger. In this spirit we all worked. I must now introduce the reader to the two great admirals of the fleet, Lord Fisher and Sir Arthur Wilson, whose outstanding qualities and life's work, afloat and at the Admiralty, added to and reacted upon by the energies and patriotism of Lord Charles Beresford, had largely made the Royal Navy what it was at this time. The names of both Fisher and Wilson must often recur in these pages, for they play decisive parts in the tale I have to tell. I first met Lord Fisher at Biarritz in 1907. We stayed for a fortnight as the guests of a common friend. He was then First Sea Lord, and in the height of his reign. We talked all day long and far into the nights. He told me wonderful stories of the Navy and of his plans, all about dreadnoughts, all about submarines, all about the new education scheme for every branch of the Navy, all about big guns and splendid admirals and foolish miserable ones, and Nelson and the Bible, and finally the island of Borkum. I remember it all. I reflected on it often. I even remembered the island of Borkum when my teacher had ceased to think so much of it. At any rate, when I returned to my duties at the Colonial Office, I could have passed an examination on the policy of the then Board of Admiralty. For at least 10 years, all the most important steps taken to enlarge, improve, or modernize the Navy had been due to Fisher. The water tube boiler, the, quote, all-big-gun ship, end quote, the introduction of the submarine, Fisher's toys, as Lord Charles Beresford called them, the common education scheme, the system of nucleus crews for ships in reserve, and latterly, to meet the German rivalry, the concentration of the fleets in home waters, the scrapping of great quantities of ships of little fighting power, the great naval programs of 1908 and 1909, the advance from the 12-inch to the 13.5-inch gun, all in the main were his. In carrying through these far-reaching changes, he had created violent oppositions to himself in the Navy, and his own methods, in which he gloried, were of a kind to excite bitter animosities, which he returned and was eager to repay. He made it known, indeed he proclaimed, that officers of whatever rank who opposed his policies would have their professional careers ruined. As for traitors, i.e. those who struck at him openly or secretly, quote, Their wives should be widows, their children fatherless, their homes a dunghill." End quote. This he repeated again and again. Ruthless, relentless, and remorseless were words always on his lips, and many grisly examples of admirals and captains eating out their hearts, quote, "on the beach," end quote, showed that he meant what he said. He did not hesitate to express his policy in the most unfavorable terms, as if to challenge and defy his enemies and his critics. Quote, "Favoritism," he wrote in the log of Dartmouth College, "is the secret of efficiency." End quote. What he meant by favoritism was selection without regard to seniority by a discerning genius in the interests of the public. But the word favoritism stuck. Officers were said to be, quote, "in the fish pond," quote, unlucky for them if they were not. He poured contempt upon the opinions and arguments of those who did not agree with his schemes, and abused them roundly at all times both by word and letter. In the Royal Navy, however, there were a considerable number of officers of social influence and independent means, many of whom became hostile to Fisher. They had access to Parliament and to the press. In sympathy with them, though not with all their methods, was a much larger body of good and proved sea officers. At the head of the whole opposition stood Lord Charles Beresford, at that time Commander-in-Chief of the Channel or Principal Fleet. A deplorable schism was introduced into the Royal Navy, which spread to every squadron and to every ship. There were Fisher's men and Beresford's men. Whatever the First Sea Lord proposed, the Commander-in-Chief opposed, and through the whole of the service, captains and lieutenants were encouraged to take one side or the other. The argument was conducted with technicalities and with personalities. Neither side was strong enough to crush the other. The Admiralty had its backers in the fleet, and the fleet had its friends in the Admiralty. Both sides, therefore, had good information as to what was passing in the other camp. The lamentable situation thus created might easily have ruined the discipline of the Navy but for the fact that a third large body of officers resolutely refused, at whatever cost to themselves, to participate in the struggle. Silently and steadfastly they went about their work till the storms of partisanship were past. To these officers a debt is due. There is no doubt whatever that Fisher was right in 9/10 of what he fought for. His great reforms sustained the power of the Royal Navy at the most critical period in its history. He gave the Navy the kind of shock which the British Army received at the time of the South African War. After a long period of serene and unchallenged complacency, the mutter of distant thunder could be heard. It was Fisher who hoisted the storm signal and beat all hands to quarters. He forced every department of the naval services to review its position and question its own existence. He shook them and beat them and cajoled them out of a slumber into intense activity. But the Navy was not a pleasant place while this was going on. The Band of Brothers tradition, which Nelson had handed down, was for the time, but only for the time, discarded, and behind the open hostility of chieftains flourished the venomous intrigues of their followers. I have asked myself whether all this could not have been avoided, whether we could not have had the Fisher reforms without the Fisher methods. My conviction is that Fisher was maddened by the difficulties and obstructions which he encountered, and became violent in the process of fighting so hard at every step. In the government of a great fighting service there must always be the combination of the political and professional authorities. A strong First Sea Lord, to carry out a vigorous policy, needs the assistance of a minister who alone can support him and defend him. The authority of both is more than doubled by their union. Each can render the other services of supreme importance when they are both effective factors. Working in harmony, they multiply each other. By the resultant concentration of combined power, no room or chance is given to faction. For good or for ill, what they decide together in the interests of the service must be loyally accepted. Unhappily, The later years of Fisher's efforts were years in which the Admiralty was ruled by two ministers, both of whom were desperately and even mortally ill. Although most able and most upright public men, both Lord Cawdor and Lord Tweedmouth, First Lords from 1904 to 1908, were afflicted with extreme ill health. Moreover, neither was in the House of Commons and able himself, by exposition in the responsible chamber, to proclaim in unquestioned accents the policy which the Admiralty would follow and which the House of Commons should ratify. When, in 1908, Mr. McKenna became First Lord, there was a change. Gifted with remarkable clearness of mind and resolute courage, enjoying in the prime of life the fullest vigor of his faculties, and having acquired a strong political position in the House of Commons, he was able to supply an immediate steadying influence. But it was too late for Fisher. The Furies were upon his track. The opposition and hatreds had already grown too strong. The schism in the Navy continued, fierce and open. The incident which is most commonly associated with the end of this part of his career is that of the Bacon letters. Captain Bacon was one of the ablest officers in the Navy and a strong Fisherite. In 1906, he had been serving in the Mediterranean under Lord Charles Beresford. Fisher had asked him to write to him from time to time and keep him informed of all that passed. This he did in letters in themselves of much force and value, but open to the reproach of containing criticisms of his immediate commander. This in itself might have escaped unnoticed, but the First Sea Lord used to print in beautiful and carefully considered type letters, notes, and memoranda on technical subjects for the instruction and encouragement of the faithful. Delighted at the cogency of the arguments in the Bacon letters, he had them printed in 1909 and circulated fairly widely throughout the Admiralty. A copy fell at length into hostile hands and was swiftly conveyed to a London evening newspaper. The First Sea Lord was accused of encouraging subordinates in disloyalty to their immediate commanders, and Captain Bacon himself was so grievously smitten in the opinion of the service that he withdrew into private life, and his exceptional abilities were lost to the Navy, though, as will be seen, only for a time. The episode was fatal, and at the beginning of 1910, Sir John Fisher quitted the Admiralty and passed, as everyone believed, finally into retirement and the House of Lords, crowned with achievements, loaded with honors, but pursued by much obloquy amid the triumph of his foes. As soon as I knew for certain that I was to go to the Admiralty, I sent for Fisher. He was abroad in sunshine. We had not seen each other since the dispute about the naval estimates of 1909. He conceived himself bound in loyalty to Mr. McKenna, but as soon as he learned that I had had nothing to do with the decision which had led to our changing offices, he hastened home. We passed 3 days together in the comfort of Reigate Priory. Although my education had been mainly military, I had followed closely every detail of the naval controversies of the previous 5 years in the Cabinet, in Parliament, and latterly in the Committee of Imperial Defence, and I had certain main ideas of what I was going to do and what, indeed, I was sent to the Admiralty to do. I intended to prepare for an attack by Germany as if it might come next day. I intended to raise the fleet to the highest possible strength and secure that all that strength was immediately ready. I was pledged to create a war staff. I was resolved to have all arrangements made at once in the closest concert with the military to provide for the transportation of a British army to France should war come. I had strong support from the War Office and the Foreign Office. I had the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer at my back. Moreover, everyone who knew the crisis through which we had passed had been profoundly alarmed. In these circumstances, it only remained to study the methods and to choose the men. I found Fisher a veritable volcano of knowledge and of inspiration, and as soon as he learnt what my main purpose was, he passed into a state of vehement eruption. It must indeed have been an agony to him to wait and idly watch from the calm Lake of Lucerne through the anxious weeks of the long-drawn Agadir crisis, with his life's work, his beloved Navy, liable at any moment to be put to the supreme test. Once he began, he could hardly stop. I plied him with questions, and he poured out ideas. It was always a joy to me to talk to him on these great matters, but most of all was he stimulating in all that related to the design of ships. He also talked brilliantly about admirals, but here one had to make a heavy discount on account of the feuds. My intention was to hold the balance even, and while adopting in the main the Fisher policy, to insist upon an absolute cessation of the vendetta. Knowing pretty well all that has been written in the preceding pages, I began our conversations with no thought of Fisher's recall. But by the Sunday night the power of the man was deeply borne in upon me, and I had almost made up my mind to do what I did 3 years later, and place him again at the head of the naval service. It was not the outcry that I feared, that I felt strong enough at this time to face, but it was the revival and continuance of the feuds, and it was clear from his temper that this would be inevitable. Then, too, I was apprehensive of his age. I could not feel complete confidence in the poise of the mind at 71. All the way up to London the next morning I was on the brink of saying, "Come and help me," and had he by a word seemed to wish to return, I would surely have spoken, but he maintained a proper dignity, and in an hour we were in London. Other reflections supervened, adverse counsels were not lacking, and in a few days I had definitely made up my mind to look elsewhere for a first sea lord. I wonder whether I was right or wrong. For a man who for so many years filled great official positions and was charged with so much secret and deadly business, Lord Fisher appeared amazingly voluminous and reckless in correspondence. When for the purposes of this work and for the satisfaction of his biographers I collected all the letters I had received from the Admiral in his own hand, they amounted when copied to upwards of 300 closely typewritten pages. In the main they repeat again and again the principal naval conceptions and doctrines with which his life had been associated. Although it would be easy to show many inconsistencies and apparent contradictions, the general message is unchanging. The letters are also presented in an entertaining guise, interspersed with felicitous and sometimes recondite quotations, with flashing phrases and images, with mordant jokes and corrosive personalities. All were dashed off red-hot as they left his mind, his strong pen galloping along in the wake of the imperious thought. He would often audaciously fling out on paper thoughts which other people would hardly admit to their own minds. It is small wonder that his turbulent passage left so many foes foaming in his wake. The wonder is that he did not shipwreck himself a score of times. The buoyancy of his genius alone supported the burden. Indeed, in the process of years, the profuse and imprudent violence of his letters became, in a sense, its own protection. People came to believe that this was the breezy style appropriate to our guardians of the deep, and the old admiral swept forward on his stormy course. To me, in this period of preparation, the arrival of his letters was always a source of lively interest and pleasure. I was regaled with 8 or 10 closely written double pages, fastened together with a little pearl pin or a scrap of silk ribbon, and containing every kind of news and counsel, varying from blistering reproach to the highest forms of inspiration and encouragement. From the very beginning, his letters were couched in an affectionate and paternal style. "My beloved Winston," they began, ending usually with a variation of "yours to a cinder," "yours till hell freezes," or "till charcoal sprouts," followed by a P.S., and 2 or 3 more pages of pregnant and brilliant matter. I have found it impossible to reread these letters without sentiments of strong regard for him, his fiery soul, his volcanic energy, his deep creative mind, his fierce outspoken hatreds, his love of England. Alas, there was a day when hell froze and charcoal sprouted and friendship was reduced to cinders, when "my beloved Winston" had given place to, quote, "First Lord, I can no longer be your colleague," end quote. I am glad to be able to chronicle that this was not the end of our long and intimate relationship. Sir Arthur Wilson, the first Sea Lord, received me with his customary dignified simplicity. He could not, of course, be wholly unaware of the main causes which had brought me to the Admiralty. In conversation with the other Sea Lords, when the well-kept secret of my appointment first reached the Admiralty, he said, quote, "We are to have new masters. If they wish us to serve them, we will do so, and if not, they will find others to carry on the work." End quote. I had only met him hitherto at the conferences of the Committee of Imperial Defense, and my opinions were divided between an admiration for all I heard of his character and a total disagreement with what I understood to be his strategic views. He considered the creation of a war staff quite unnecessary. I had come to set one up. He did not approve of the War Office plans for sending an army to France in the event of war. I considered it my duty to perfect these arrangements to the smallest detail. He was, as I believed, still an advocate of a close blockade of the German ports, which to my lay or military mind the torpedo seemed already to have rendered impossible. These were large and vital differences. He, on his side, probably thought we had got into an unnecessary panic over the Agadir crisis, and that we did not properly understand the strength and mobility of the British fleet, nor the true character of British strategic power. He was due to retire for age from the service in 3 or 4 months, unless his tenure had been extended, while I, for my part, came to the Admiralty with a very clear intention to have an entirely new board of my own choosing. In these circumstances, our association was bound to be bleak. This is, however, the moment for me to give an impression of this striking naval personality. He was, without any exception, the most selfless man I have ever met or even read of. He wanted nothing, and he feared nothing, absolutely nothing. Whether he was commanding the British fleet or repairing an old motor car, he was equally keen, equally interested, equally content. To step from a great office into absolute retirement, to return from retirement to the pinnacle of naval power, were transitions which produced no change in the beat of that constant heart. Everything was duty. It was not merely that nothing else mattered. There was nothing else. One did one's duty as well as one possibly could, be it great or small, and naturally one deserved no reward. This had been the spirit in which he had lived his long life afloat, and which by his example he had spread far and wide through the ranks of the Navy. It made him seem very unsympathetic on many occasions, both to officers and men. Orders were orders, whether they terminated an officer's professional career or led him on to fame, whether they involved the most pleasant or the most disagreeable work, and he would snap his teeth and smile his wintry smile to all complaints and to sentiment and emotion in every form. Never once did I see his composure disturbed. He never opened up, never unbent. Never once, until a very dark day for me, did I learn that my work had met with favor in his eyes. All the same, for all his unsympathetic methods, Tug, as he was generally called, because he was always working, i.e. pulling, hauling, tugging, or, alternatively, Old Art was greatly loved in the fleet. Men would do hard and unpleasant work even when they doubted its necessity, because he had ordered it, and it was his way. He had served as a midshipman in the Crimean War. Everyone knew the story of his V.C. when the square broke out at Tamai in the Sudan, and when he was seen with the ammunition of his Gatling exhausted, knocking the dervish spearmen over one after another with his fists, using the broken hilt of his sword as a sort of knuckle-duster. Stories were told of his apparent insensibility to weather and climate. He would wear a thin monkey jacket in midwinter in the North Sea with apparent comfort, while everyone else was shivering in greatcoats. He would stand bareheaded under a tropical sun without ill effects. He had a strong, inventive turn of mind and considerable mechanical knowledge. The system of countermining in use for 40 years in the Navy, and the masthead semaphore which continued till displaced by wireless telegraphy, were both products of his ingenuity. He was an experienced and masterly commander of a fleet at sea. In addition to this, he expressed himself with great clearness and thoroughness on paper, many of his documents being extended arguments of exact detail and widely comprehensive scope. He impressed me from the first as a man of the highest quality and stature, but, as I thought, dwelling too much in the past of naval science, not sufficiently receptive of new ideas when conditions were changing so rapidly, and, of course, tenacious and unyielding in the last degree. End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Chapter 4, Part 2 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill. Admirals All. After we had had several preliminary talks, and I found we were not likely to reach an agreement, I sent him a minute about the creation of a naval war staff, which raised an unmistakable issue. He met it by a powerfully reasoned and unqualified refusal, and I then determined to form a new Board of Admiralty without delay. The Lords of the Admiralty hold quasi-ministerial appointments, and it was of course necessary to put my proposals before the Prime Minister and obtain his assent. Mr. Churchill to the Prime Minister. HMS Enchantress, Portsmouth, November 5th, 1911. The enclosed memorandum from Sir A. Wilson is decisive in its opposition not only to any particular scheme, but against the whole principle of a war staff for the Navy. Otley's rejoinder, which I also send you, shows that it would not be difficult to continue the argument. But I feel that this might easily degenerate into personal controversy, and would, in any case, be quite unavailing. I like Sir A. Wilson personally, and should be very sorry to run the risk of embittering relations which are now pleasant. I therefore propose to take no public action during his tenure. If Wilson retires in the ordinary course in March, I shall be left without a First Sea Lord in the middle of the passage of the estimates, and his successor will not be able to take any real responsibility for them. It is necessary, therefore, that the change should be made in January at the latest. I could, if it were imperative, propose to you a new board for submission to the King at once. The field of selection for the first place is narrow, and since I have, with a good deal of reluctance, abandoned the idea of bringing Fisher back, no striking appointment is possible. I may, however, just as well enjoy the advantage of reserving a final choice for another month. At present, therefore, I will only say that Prince Louis is certainly the best man to be second Sea Lord, that I find myself in cordial agreement with him on nearly every important question of naval policy, and that he will accept the appointment gladly. I should thus hope to start in the new year with a united and progressive board, and with the goodwill of both the factions whose animosities have done so much harm. Meanwhile, I am elaborating the scheme of a war staff. Mr. Churchill to the Prime Minister. November 16th, 1911. I have now to put before you my proposals for a new Board of Admiralty, and the changes consequent thereupon. Having now seen all the principal officers who might be considered candidates for such a post, I pronounce decidedly in favor of Sir Francis Bridgeman as the First Sea Lord. He's a fine sailor with the full confidence of the service afloat, and with the aptitude for working with and through a staff well developed. If, as would no doubt be the case, he should bring Captain de Bartolome as his naval assistant, I am satisfied that the work of this office would proceed smoothly and with dispatch. I have discussed the principal questions of strategy, administration, and finance with him, and believe that we are in general agreement on fundamental principles. If you approve, I will write to Sir Francis and enter more fully into these matters in connection with an assumption by him of these new duties. This appointment harmonizes, personally and administratively, with that of the new second Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, of whom I have already written to you, and of whose assistance I have the highest expectations. Rear Admiral Briggs, the Controller and third Sea Lord, has, after a year, just begun to acquire a complete knowledge of his very extensive department, and I do not think it necessary to transfer him at the present time. He will be the only naval member of the old board to remain. Rear Admiral Madden is, in any case, leaving on January 5th, and I am advised from all quarters, including both the proposed first and second Sea Lords, that the best man to fill his place is Captain Pakenham. This officer, who is very highly thought of for his intellectual attainments, has also the rare distinction of having served throughout the Russo-Japanese War, including the Battle of the Tsushima. The home fleet, which becomes vacant, has not, unhappily, any candidate of clear and preeminent qualifications. Admiral Jellicoe is not yet sufficiently in command of the confidence of the sea service to justify what would necessarily be a very startling promotion. I shall, however, be taking the perfectly straightforward and unexceptionable course in placing Vice Admiral Sir George Callahan, the present second in command, who has been in almost daily control of the largest maneuvers of the home fleet, and who has previously been second in command in the Mediterranean, in the place of Sir F. Bridgman. Sir John Jellicoe will be his second in command, and we shall thus be able to see what fitness he will develop for the succession. It appears to me not merely important, but necessary that these changes should operate without delay. The draft estimates have all arrived for discussion, and a month of the most severe work, governing the whole future policy of the next 2 years, awaits the Board of Admiralty. This task can only be satisfactorily discharged if it is undertaken by men who come together with consenting minds, and who will find themselves responsible to the Cabinet and to Parliament for the immediate consequences of their decisions. I would therefore ask you to authorize me to approach all parties concerned without delay, and unless some unexpected hitch occurs, I shall hope to submit the list to the King not later than Wednesday next. The new board would thus be fully constituted before the end of the present month. Afloat, the decisive appointment was that of Sir John Jellicoe to be second in command of the home fleet. He thus, in effect, passed over the heads of 4 or 5 of the most important senior admirals on the active list, and became virtually designated for the supreme command in the near future. The announcement of these changes, November 28th, created a considerable sensation in the House of Commons when, late at night, they became known. All the Sea Lords, except one, had been replaced by new men. I was immediately interrogated. Quote, had they resigned or been told to go? End quote, and so on. I gave briefly such explanations as were necessary. At this time I was very strong, because most of those who knew the inner history of the Agadir crisis were troubled about the fleet, and it was well known that I had been sent to the Admiralty to make a new and a vehement effort. Sir Arthur Wilson and I parted on friendly, civil, but at the same time cool terms. He showed not the least resentment at the short curtailment of his tenure. He was as good-tempered and as distant as ever. Only once did he show the slightest sign of vehemence. That was when I told him that the Prime Minister was willing to submit his name to the King for a peerage. He disengaged himself from this with much vigor. What would he do with such a thing? It would be ridiculous. However, His Majesty resolved to confer upon him the Order of Merit, and this he was finally persuaded to accept. On his last night in office, he gave a dinner to the new Sea Lords in the true Band of Brothers style, and then retired to Norfolk. I could not help thinking uncomfortably of the famous Tenniel cartoon, Dropping the Pilot, where the inexperienced and impulsive German emperor is depicted carelessly watching the venerable figure of Bismarck descending the ladder. Nevertheless, I had acted on high public grounds, and on those alone, and I fortified myself with them. As will be seen in its proper place, Sir Arthur Wilson came back to the Admiralty 3 years later and worked with Lord Fisher and me during the 6 months of our association in the war. When Lord Fisher resigned in May 1915, I invited Sir Arthur to take up the duties of First Sea Lord, and he consented to do so. On learning, however, a few days later that I was to leave the Admiralty, he wrote to Mr. Asquith refusing to undertake the task under any other First Lord but me. Here is his letter. May 19th, 1915. Dear Mr. Asquith, in view of the reports in the papers this morning as to the probable reconstruction of the government, I think I ought to tell you that although I agreed to undertake the office of First Sea Lord under Mr. Churchill, because it appeared to me to be the best means of maintaining continuity of policy under the unfortunate circumstances that have arisen, I am not prepared to undertake the duties under any new First Lord, as the strain under such circumstances would be far beyond my strength. Believe me, yours truly, A.K. Wilson. At that time, I hardly seemed to have a friend in the official or parliamentary world. All the press were throwing the blame of the Dardanelles entanglement and of many other things upon me, and I was everywhere represented as a rash, presumptuous person with whom no Board of Admiralty could work. Sir Arthur had never previously given me any sign of approval, though of course we had labored together day after day. I was, therefore, astounded to learn what he had done. It came as an absolute surprise to me, and I do not mind saying that I felt as proud as a young officer mentioned for the first time in dispatches. I thought it my duty, however, to try to overcome his objections, as I knew the Prime Minister wanted him to take the post, but it was all in vain. He stuck to his opinion that he could do it with me and with nobody else. I felt deeply touched. There was nothing to be touched about, he observed. Quote, "You know all the moves on the board. I should only have to put the brake on from time to time. I could not possibly manage with anyone else." End quote. And that was the end of it. He continued working in a subordinate position at the Admiralty till the end of the war. I hardly ever saw him afterwards, but I have preserved a memory which is very precious to me. The new Fourth Sea Lord was an officer of singular firmness of character. He possessed a unique experience of naval war. Since Nelson himself, no British naval officer had been so long at sea in time of war, on a ship of war, without setting foot on land. Captain Pakenham had been 14 months afloat in the battleship Asahi during the war between Russia and Japan. Although this vessel was frequently in harbor, he would not leave it for fear she might sail without him, and there, alone, the sole European in a great ship's company of valiant, reticent, inscrutable Japanese, he had gone through the long vigil outside Port Arthur, with its repeated episodes of minefields and bombardments, till the final battle in the Sea of Japan. Always faultlessly attired, with stiff white collar and an immovable eyeglass, he matched the Japanese with a punctilio and reserve the equal of their own, and finally captivated their martial spirit and won their unstinted and outspoken admiration. Admiral Togo has related how the English officer, as the Asahi was going into action at the last great battle, when the heavy shells had already begun to strike the ship, remained impassive alone on the open afterbridge, making his notes and taking his observations of the developing action for the reports which he was going to send to his government, and acclaiming him with Japanese chivalry, recommended him to the Emperor for the highest honor this warlike and knightly people could bestow. The unique seagoing record in time of war on a ship of war which Captain Pakenham brought to the Admiralty has been maintained by him to this day, and to 14 months of seagoing service with the Japanese fleet, he may now add 52 months' constant service with the battle cruisers, during which time it is credibly reported that he never on any occasion at sea lay down to rest otherwise than fully dressed, collared, and booted, ready at any moment of the night or day. A few weeks after my arrival at the Admiralty, I was told that among several officers of flag rank who wished to see me was Rear Admiral Beatty. I had never met him before, but I had the following impressions about him. First, that he was the youngest flag officer in the fleet. Second, that he had commanded the white gunboat which had come up the Nile as close as possible to support the 21st Lancers when we made the charge at Omdurman. Third, that he had seen a lot of fighting on land with the Army, and that consequently he had military as well as naval experience. Fourth, that he came of a hard-riding stock. His father had been in my own regiment, the 4th Hussars, and I had often heard him talked of when I first joined. The Admiral, I knew, was a very fine horseman, with what is called an eye for country. Fifth, that there was much talk in naval circles of his having been pushed on too fast. Such were the impressions aroused in my mind by the name of this officer, and I record them with minuteness because the decisions which I had the honor of taking in regard to him were most serviceable to the Royal Navy and to the British arms. I was, however, advised about him at the Admiralty in a decisively adverse sense. He had got on too fast. He had many interests ashore. His heart, it was said, was not wholly in the service. He had been offered an appointment in the Atlantic Fleet suited to his rank as Rear Admiral. He had declined this appointment, a very serious step for a naval officer to take when appointments were few in proportion to candidates, and he should, in consequence, not be offered any further employment. It would be contrary to precedent to make a further offer. He had already been unemployed for 18 months, and would probably be retired in the ordinary course at the expiration of the full 3 years' unemployment. But my first meeting with the Admiral induced me immediately to disregard this unfortunate advice. He became at once my naval secretary, or private secretary as the appointment was then styled. Working thus side by side in rooms which communicated, we perpetually discussed during the next 15 months the problems of a naval war with Germany. It became increasingly clear to me that he viewed questions of naval strategy and tactics in a different light from the average naval officer. He approached them, as it seemed to me, much more as a soldier would. His war experiences on land had illuminated the facts he had acquired in his naval training. He was no mere instrumentalist. He did not think of material as an end in itself, but only as a means. He thought of war problems in their unity by land, sea, and air. His mind had been rendered quick and supple by the situations of polo and the hunting field, and enriched by varied experiences against the enemy on Nile gunboats and ashore. It was with equal pleasure and profit that I discussed with him our naval problem, now from this angle, now from that, and I was increasingly struck with the shrewd and profound sagacity of his comments expressed in language singularly free from technical jargon. I had no doubts whatever when the command of the battle-cruiser squadron fell vacant in the spring of 1913 in appointing him over the heads of all to this incomparable command, the nucleus, as it proved to be, of the famous battle-cruiser fleet, the strategic cavalry of the Royal Navy, that supreme combination of speed and power to which the thoughts of the Admiralty were continuously directed. And when 2 years later, February 3, 1915, I visited him on board the Lion, with the scars of victorious battle fresh upon her from the action of the Dogger Bank, I heard from his captains and his admirals the expression of their respectful but intense enthusiasm for their leader. Well do I remember how, as I was leaving the ship, the usually imperturbable Admiral Pakenham caught me by the sleeve. Quote, "First Lord, I wish to speak to you in private," and the restrained passion in his voice as he said, "Nelson has come again." End quote. Those words often recurred to my mind. So much of my work in endeavoring to prepare the fleet for war was dependent upon the guidance and help I received from Prince Louis of Battenberg, who, taking it as a whole, was my principal counselor as Second Sea Lord from January 1912 to March 1913, when Sir Francis Bridgeman's health temporarily failed, and as First Sea Lord thenceforward to the end of October 1914. That it is necessary to give some description of this remarkable prince and British sailor. All the more is this necessary since the accident of his parentage struck him down in the opening months of the Great War and terminated his long professional career. Prince Louis was a child of the Royal Navy. From his earliest years he had been bred to the sea. The deck of a British warship was his home. All his interest was centered in the British fleet. So far from his exalted rank having helped him, it had hindered his career. Up to a certain point, no doubt, it had been of assistance, but after that it had been a positive drawback. In consequence, he had spent an exceptionally large proportion of his 40 years' service afloat, usually in the less agreeable commands. One had heard at Malta how he used to bring his cruiser squadron into that small, crowded harbor at speed, and then, in the nick of time, with scarcely 100 yards to spare, by dropping his anchors, checking on his cables, and going full speed astern, bring it safely into station. He had a far wider knowledge of war by land and sea and of the continent of Europe than most of the other admirals I have known. His brother, as King of Bulgaria, had shown military aptitudes of a very high order at the Battle of Slivnitza, and he himself was deeply versed in every detail, practical and theoretic, of the British naval service. It was not without good reason that he had been appointed under Lord Fisher to be head of the British Naval Intelligence Department, that vital ganglion of our organization. He was a thoroughly trained and accomplished staff officer, with a gift of clear and lucid statement and all that thoroughness and patient industry which we have never underestimated in the German race. It was recounted of him that on one occasion, when he visited Kiel with King Edward, a German admiral in high command had reproached him with serving in the British fleet, whereat Prince Louis, stiffening, had replied, quote, "Sir, when I joined the Royal Navy in the year 1868, the German Empire did not exist." End quote. The part which he played in the events with which I am dealing will be recorded as the story unfolds. Our first labor was the creation of the War Staff. All the details of this were worked out by Prince Louis and approved by the First Sea Lord. I also resorted to Sir Douglas Haig, at that time in command at Aldershot. The general furnished me with a masterly paper setting forth the military doctrine of staff organization and constituting in many respects a formidable commentary on existing naval methods. Armed with these various opinions, I presented my conclusions to the public in January 1912 in a document of which the first 2 paragraphs may be repeated here. They were, as will be seen, designed so far as possible to disarm the prejudices of the naval service. 1. In establishing a war staff for the Navy, it is necessary to observe the broad differences of character and circumstances which distinguish naval from military problems. War on land varies in every country according to numberless local conditions, and each new theater, like each separate battlefield, requires a special study. A whole series of intricate arrangements must be thought out and got ready for each particular case, and these are expanded and refined continuously by every increase in the size of armies and by every step towards the perfection of military science. The means by which superior forces can be brought to decisive points in good condition and at the right time are no whit less vital and involve far more elaborate processes than the strategic choice of those points or the actual conduct of the fighting. The sea, on the other hand, is all one, and though ever-changing, always the same. Every ship is self-contained and self-propelled. The problems of transport and supply, the infinite peculiarities of topography, which are the increasing study of the general staffs of Europe, do not affect the naval service except in an occasional and limited degree. The main part of the British fleet, in sufficient strength to seek a general battle, is always ready to proceed to sea without any mobilization of reserves as soon as steam is raised. Ships or fleets of ships are capable of free and continuous movement for many days and nights together, and travel at least as far in an hour as an army can march in a day. Every vessel is in instant communication with its fleet and with the Admiralty, and all can be directed from the ports where they are stationed on any sea points chosen for massing by a short and simple order. Unit efficiency, that is to say, the individual fighting power of each vessel and each man, is in the sea service for considerable periods entirely independent of all external arrangements, and unit efficiency at sea, far more even than on land, is the prime and final factor without which the combinations of strategy and tactics are only the preliminaries of defeat, but with which even faulty dispositions can be swiftly and decisively retrieved. For these and other similar reasons, a naval war staff does not require to be designed on the same scale or in the same form as the general staff of the army. 2. Naval war is at once more simple and more intense than war on land. The executive action and control of fleet and squadron commanders is direct and personal in a far stronger degree than that of generals in the field, especially under modern conditions. The art of handling a great fleet on important occasions with deft and sure judgment is the supreme gift of the admiral, and practical seamanship must never be displaced from its position as the first qualification of every sailor. The formation of a war staff does not mean the setting up of new standards of professional merit or the opening of a road of advancement to a different class of officers. It is to be the means of preparing and training those officers who arrive, or are likely to arrive, by the excellence of their sea service at stations of high responsibility for dealing with the more extended problems which await them there. It is to be the means of sifting, developing, and applying the results of actual experience in history and present practice, and of preserving them as a general stock of reasoned opinion available as an aid and as a guide for all who are called upon to determine, in peace or war, the naval policy of the country. It is to be a brain far more comprehensive than that of any single man, however gifted, and tireless and unceasing in its action, applied continuously to the scientific and speculative study of naval strategy and preparation. It is to be an instrument capable of formulating any decision which has been taken, or may be taken, by the executive in terms of precise and exhaustive detail. I never ceased to labor at the formation of a true general staff for the Navy. In May 1914, basing myself on the report of a committee which I had set up a year before, I drafted a fairly complete scheme for the further development of staff training. I quote a salient passage. It is necessary to draw a distinction between the measures required to secure a general diffusion of military knowledge among naval officers and the definite processes by which staff officers are trained. The first may be called military education, and the second, war staff training. They require to be treated separately and not mixed together as in the report of the committee. Both must again be distinguished from all questions of administration, of material, and of non-military education and training. The application of fighting power can thus be separated from its development. We are not now concerned with the forging of the weapon, but only with its use. Quote, as early as possible in his service, the mind of the young officer must be turned to the broad principles of war by sea and land. His interest must be awakened. He must be put in touch with the right books and must be made to feel the importance of the military aspect of his profession." End quote. But it takes a generation to form a general staff. No wave of the wand can create those habits of mind in seniors on which the efficiency and even the reality of a staff depends. Young officers can be trained, but thereafter they have to rise step by step in the passage of time to positions of authority in the service. The dead weight of professional opinion was adverse. They had got on well enough without it before. They did not want a special class of officer professing to be more brainy than the rest. Sea time should be the main qualification, and next to that, technical aptitudes. Thus, when I went to the Admiralty, I found that there was no moment in the career and training of a naval officer when he was obliged to read a single book about naval war or pass even the most rudimentary examination in naval history. The Royal Navy had made no important contribution to naval literature. The standard work on sea power was written by an American admiral. The best accounts of British sea fighting and naval strategy were compiled by an English civilian. The silent service was not mute because it was absorbed in thought and study, but because it was weighted down by its daily routine and by its ever-complicating and diversifying technique. We had competent administrators, brilliant experts of every description, unequaled navigators, good disciplinarians, fine sea officers, brave and devoted hearts. But at the outset of the conflict, we had more captains of ships than captains of war. In this will be found the explanation of many untoward events. At least 15 years of consistent policy were required to give the Royal Navy that widely extended outlook upon war problems and of war situations without which seamanship, gunnery, instrumentalisms of every kind, devotion of the highest order, could not achieve their due reward. 15 years, and we were only to have 30 months. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Chapter 5, Part 1 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill. The German Navy Law, 1912. The young disease, that must subdue at length, grows with his growth, and strengthens with his strength. Pope, Essay on Man. The Morrow of Agadir. Mission of Sir Ernest Cassell. The New German Navy Law. The Haldane Visit to Berlin. An Imperial Mare's Nest. The Opening of the Reichstag. A Speech at Glasgow. The Luxus Flot. Mr. Haldane returns. Attempt to reach a settlement. Correspondence with Lord Fisher. Fisher's vision. The Navy estimates. The naval holiday. Efforts at goodwill. Consequences of German naval power. Von Tirpitz's illusions. Anglo-French naval conversations. The Entente strengthened. Von Tirpitz's unwisdom. Organization of the Navy. The new structure. With the fleet. The Enchantress in Portland Harbor. The safeguard of freedom. I have shown how forward the Chancellor of the Exchequer was during the crisis of Agadir in every matter that could add to the strength of the British attitude. But as soon as the danger was past, he adopted a different demeanor. He felt that an effort should be made to heal any smart from which Germany might be suffering, and to arrive at a common understanding on naval strength. We knew that a formidable new Navy law was in preparation and would shortly be declared. If Germany had definitely made up her mind to antagonize Great Britain, we must take up the challenge, but it might be possible by friendly, sincere, and intimate conversation to avert this perilous development. We were no enemies to German colonial expansion, and we would even have taken active steps to further her wishes in this respect. Surely, something could be done to break the chain of blind causation. If aiding Germany in the colonial sphere was a means of procuring a stable situation, it was a price we were well prepared to pay. I was in full accord with this view. Apart from wider reasons, I felt I should be all the stronger in asking the Cabinet and the House of Commons for the necessary moneys, if I could go hand in hand with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and testify that we had tried our best to secure a mitigation of the naval rivalry and failed. We therefore jointly consulted Sir Edward Grey, and then with the Prime Minister's concurrence, we invited Sir Ernest Cassel to go to Berlin and get into direct touch with the Emperor. Sir Ernest was qualified for this task, as he knew the Emperor well and was at the same time devoted to British interests. We armed him with a brief but pregnant memorandum, which cannot be more tersely summarized than in von Bethmann-Hollweg's own words. Acceptance of English superiority at sea, no augmentation of the German naval program, a reduction as far as possible of that program, and on the part of England, no impediment to our colonial expansion, discussion and promotion of our colonial ambitions, proposals for mutual declarations that the two powers would not take part in aggressive plans or combinations against one another. Cassel accepted the charge and started at once. He remained only 2 days in Berlin and came at once to me on his return. He brought with him a cordial letter from the Emperor and a fairly full statement by von Bethmann-Hollweg of the new German Navy law. We devoured this invaluable document all night long in the Admiralty, and in the morning I wrote as follows to Sir Edward Grey. January 31st, 1912. Cassel returned last night, having traveled continuously from Berlin. At 10 a.m. on Monday, he saw Ballon, who went forthwith to the German Chancellor, and in the afternoon he saw Ballon, Bethmann-Hollweg, and the Emperor together. They all appeared deeply pleased by the overture. Bethmann-Hollweg, earnest and cordial, the Emperor, enchanted, almost childishly so. The Emperor talked a great deal on naval matters to Cassel, the details of which he was unable to follow. After much consultation, the Emperor wrote out with Bethmann-Hollweg a paper, A, which Ballon transcribed. The second paper, B, is Bethmann-Hollweg's statement of the impending naval increases, translated by Cassel. Cassel says they did not seem to know what they wanted in regard to colonies. They did not seem to be greatly concerned about expansion. There were 10 large companies in Berlin importing labor into Germany. Overpopulation was not their problem. They were delighted with Cassel's rough notes of our ideas. They are most anxious to hear from us soon. Such is my report. Observations. It seems certain that the new Navy law will be presented to Reichstag, and it will be agreed to, even the socialists not resisting. The Navy increases are serious and will require new and vigorous measures on our part. The spirit may be good, but the facts are grim. I had been thinking that if the old German program had been adhered to, we should have built 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3 against their 6-year program of 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. If their new program stands, as I fear it must, and they build 3-2-3-2-3-2, we cannot build less than 5-4-5-4-5-4. This maintains 60% superiority in dreadnoughts and dreadnought cruisers over Germany only. It will also be 2 keels to 1 on their additional 3 ships. The creation of a 3rd squadron in full commission is also a serious and formidable provision. At present, owing to the fact that in the 6 winter months the 1st and 2nd squadrons of the High Sea Fleet are congested with recruits, there is a great relief to us from the strain to which we are put by German naval power. The addition of the 3rd squadron will make that strain continual throughout the year. The maintenance in full commission of 25 battleships, which after the next 4 or 5 years will all be dreadnoughts, exposes us to constant danger, only to be warded off by vigilance approximating to war conditions. A further assurance against attack is at present found in the fact that several of the German dreadnoughts are very often the wrong side of the Kiel Canal, which they cannot pass through and must therefore make a long detour. The deepening of the canal by 1913 will extinguish this safety signal. The fact that the defenders are always liable to be attacked while only at their ordinary average strength by an enemy at his selected moment and consequent maximum strength means that our margins would have to be very large. Against 25 battleships, we could not keep less than 40 available within 24 hours. This will involve additional expense. The German increase in personnel must also be met. I had intended to ask Parliament for 2,000 more men this year and 2,000 next. I expect to have to double these quotas. On the whole, the addition to our estimates consequent upon German increases will not be less than 3 millions a year. This is certainly not dropping the naval challenge. I agree with you that caution is necessary. In order to meet the new German squadron, we are contemplating bringing home the Mediterranean battleships. This means relying on France in the Mediterranean, and certainly no exchange of system would be possible, even if desired by you. The only chance I see is roughly this. They will announce their new program, and we will make an immediate and effective reply. Then, if they care to slow down the tempo so that their fleet law is accomplished in 12 and not in 6 years, friendly relations would ensue, and we, though I should be reluctant to bargain about it, could slow down too. All they would have to do would be to make their quotas biennial instead of annual. Nothing would be deranged in their plan. 12 years of tranquility would be assured in naval policy. The attempt ought to be made. We laid these matters before the Cabinet, who decided that a British cabinet minister should go to Berlin and selected Mr. Haldane for that purpose. The ex-emperor, in his memoirs, makes a ridiculous story out of this. A keen dispute had arisen among ministers, especially between Churchill and Grey, as to who should go to Berlin, in the event of achievement of the object of making Germany abandon the further development of her fleet, and affix his name to this great historical document. Churchill considered himself the right man for the job, seeing that he was the head of the navy, but Grey and Asquith would not allow their colleague to reap the glory. Thus, for a time, Grey stood in the foreground, another proof that some political purpose rather than the number of ships was the leading factor. After a while, however, it was decided that it was more fitting to Grey's personal and official importance that he should appear only at the termination of the negotiations, to affix his name to the agreement and to get his dinner from the emperor and come in for his part of the festivities and fireworks, which, in good German, means to enjoy the Bengal light illumination. As it had been decided that in any event Churchill was not to get this, it was necessary to choose somebody for the negotiations who was in close accord with Asquith and Grey, and who, possessing their complete confidence, was willing to conduct the negotiations as far as the beginning of the fireworks. One, moreover, who was already known at Berlin and not a stranger to Germany. Churchill certainly qualified to this extent, for he had attended the imperial maneuvers in Silesia and Württemberg on several occasions as a guest of the emperor. On this, it may be observed that there never was any question of my going to Berlin to negotiate about the navy, nor did I at this time wish to go. All the British ministers concerned worked together in the utmost accord. After full discussions, we authorized Sir Ernest Cassell to send the following telegram. Sir E. Cassell to Herr Ballon, drafted by Sir E. Cassell, the First Lord, Mr. Haldane, Sir Edward Grey, February 3rd, 1912. Spirit in which statements of German government have been made is most cordially appreciated here. New German program would entail serious and immediate increase of British naval expenditure, which was based on assumption that existing German naval program would be adhered to. If the British government are compelled to make such increase, it would make negotiations difficult, if not impossible. If, on the other hand, German naval expenditure can be adapted by an alteration of the tempo or otherwise so as to render any serious increase unnecessary to meet German program, British government will be prepared at once to pursue negotiations on the understanding that the point of naval expenditure is open to discussion and that there is a fair prospect of settling it favorably. If this understanding is acceptable, the British government will forthwith suggest the next step, as they think that the visit of a British minister to Berlin should, in the first instance, be private and unofficial. All being acceptable, the Secretary of State for War, accompanied by Sir Ernest Cassell, started accordingly on February 6th for Berlin. I had undertaken some weeks earlier to make a speech in support of the Home Rule Bill in Belfast. Violent hostility to this project developed in the inflammable capital of Ulster. Being publicly committed, I had no choice but to fulfill my engagement, though to avoid unnecessary provocation, the meeting place was changed from the Ulster Hall to a large tent which was erected in the outskirts of the city. Threats of violence and riot were loudly proclaimed on every side, and nearly 10,000 troops were concentrated in the area to keep the peace. I had planned, if all went well at Belfast, to go on the next day to Glasgow to inspect some of the shipbuilding works along the Clyde, and to make a speech on the naval position, which should state very plainly our route intentions and be the necessary counterpart of the Haldane mission. As I was waiting for the train for Ireland to leave the London railway station, I read in the late edition of the evening papers the German Emperor's speech on the opening of the Reichstag, announcing bills for the increase both of the army and the navy. The new navy law was still a secret to the British and German nations alike, but knowing as I did its scope and character, and viewing it in conjunction with the Army Bill, I sustained a strong impression at this moment of the approaching danger. One sentence, full of German self-revelation, stood out vividly. It is my constant duty and care to maintain and to strengthen on land and water the power of defense of the German people, which has no lack of young men fit to bear arms. It was indeed true. One thought of France with her declining birth rate peering out across her fortresses into the wide German lands and silently reflecting on these, quote, young men fit to bear arms, of whom there was indeed no lack. My mind, skipping over the day of Irish turmoil and the worry of the speech that lay before me, fixed upon Glasgow as the place where some answer to this threat of continental domination might perhaps be provided. Once again, Europe might find a safeguard against military overlordship in an island which had never been and never would be lacking in trained and hardy mariners bred from their boyhood up to the service of the sea. Accordingly, after the Irish ordeal was over, I said at Glasgow, "The purposes of British naval power are essentially defensive. We have no thoughts, and we have never had any thoughts of aggression, and we attribute no such thoughts to other great powers. There is, however, this difference between the British naval power and the naval power of the great and friendly empire, and I trust it may long remain the great and friendly empire of Germany. The British Navy is to us a necessity, and, from some points of view, the German Navy is to them more in the nature of a luxury. Our naval power involves British existence. It is existence to us. It is expansion to them. We cannot menace the peace of a single continental hamlet, no matter how great and supreme our navy may become. But, on the other hand, the whole fortunes of our race and empire, the whole treasure accumulated during so many centuries of sacrifice and achievement, would perish and be swept utterly away if our naval supremacy were to be impaired. It is the British Navy which makes Great Britain a great power. But Germany was a great power, respected and honored all over the world, before she had a single ship. If today our position is eminently satisfactory, we owe much to the foresight and resolution of Mr. McKenna. Whatever is needed for the safety of the country will be asked for by the government and granted by the representatives of the nation with universal assent. There is no need for anxiety in regard to our shipbuilding capacity. There is no chance whatever of our being overtaken in naval strength unless we want to be. But what of the men? We have today 135,000 men in the active service ratings of the Navy. The great bulk of them are long-service men who have begun as boys and have been trained as a lifelong profession to the naval service. We have no difficulty in recruiting for the Navy, and there is no doubt whatever of our ability to make any increases which may be necessary, and which I think will be necessary, in the personnel of the Navy. We have great reserves of seamen in this country. There are measures which may be taken to make a greater use of our reserves than has hitherto been found possible, and I have given directions for that part of the subject to be carefully studied by the naval experts upon whom I rely. Our reserves, both from the Royal Navy and from the Mercantile Marine, are a great resource, and this island has never been, and never will be, lacking in trained and hardy mariners bred from their boyhood up to the service of the sea. Whatever may happen abroad, there will be no whining here, no signals of distress will be hoisted, no cries for help or succor will go up. We will face the future as our ancestors would have faced it, without disquiet, without arrogance, but in stolid and inflexible determination. We should be the first power to welcome any retardation or slackening of naval rivalry. We should meet any such slackening not by words, but by deeds. If there are to be increases upon the continent of Europe, we shall have no difficulty in meeting them to the satisfaction of the country. As naval competition becomes more acute, we shall have not only to increase the number of the ships we build, but the ratio which our naval strength will have to bear to other great naval powers, so that our margin of superiority will become larger and not smaller as the strain grows greater. Thus we shall make it clear that other naval powers, instead of overtaking us by additional efforts, will only be more outdistanced in consequence of the measures which we ourselves shall take. This speech created a considerable outcry in Germany, which was immediately re-echoed by a very large proportion of our own liberal press. It appeared that the word luxury had a bad significance when translated into German. The Luxus flott became an expression passed angrily from lip to lip in Germany. As I expected, on my return to London, I found my colleagues offended. Their congratulations upon Belfast were silenced by their reproaches about Glasgow. Mr. Haldane returned 2 days later from Berlin, and the cabinet was summoned to receive an account of his mission. Contrary to general expectation, however, the Secretary of State for War declared that so far from being a hindrance to him in his negotiations, the Glasgow speech had been the greatest possible help. He had, in fact, used almost identical arguments to von Bethmann-Hollweg the day before. He had told the Chancellor that if Germany added a third squadron, we should have to maintain 5 or even 6 squadrons in home waters, perhaps bringing ships from the Mediterranean to strengthen them, that if ships were added to the existing program, we should proceed at once to lay down 2 keels to each of the new German additions, and that for the sake of the Navy, people would not complain of the addition of another shilling to the income tax. He described how he had read the operative passages in my speech himself to the Emperor and von Tirpitz in proof and confirmation of what he had himself been saying during their previous discussions. This settled the matter so far as I was concerned. It was only another instance of the very manly and loyal part which Mr. Haldane took at all times and on every question connected with the preparedness of this country for war with Germany. Mr. Haldane brought back with him the actual text of the new German Navy law, or Naval, as it was called. This had been handed to him by the Emperor during the course of the discussion. It was an elaborate technical document. Mr. Haldane had had the prudence to refuse to express any opinion upon it till it had been examined by the Admiralty experts. We now subjected this document to a rigorous scrutiny. The result more than confirmed my first unfavorable impression. The main feature in the new law, I reported to the Cabinet on February 14th, is the extraordinary increase in the striking force of ships of all classes immediately available throughout the year. Whereas formerly we reckoned against 17 battleships, 4 battle cruisers, and 12 small cruisers in the active battle fleet, demobilized to a great extent during the winter months, we must in future prepare against 25, 12, and 18, which are not to be subject to anything like the same degree of temporary demobilization. Full permanent crews are to be provided for all, or nearly all, torpedo boat destroyers, now aggregating 115, and working up to an authorized total of 144, instead of for half the number as at present. There is to be an increase on the already large provision of £750,000 in this year's estimates for submarines. The numbers are not stated, but from the fact that 121 additional executive officers are required for this service alone by 1920, we may infer that between 50 and 60 submarines are to be added. We know nothing of the rate at which this construction is to be achieved. The increases in personnel are also important. Under their existing law, the Germans are working to a total of 86,500 in 1917 by annual increments of 3,500. The new law adds 15,000 officers and men and raises the total in 1920 to 101,500. On March 9th, I pointed out that the fundamental proposition of the negotiations, from the Admiralty point of view, had been that the existing German Navy law should not be increased, but, if possible, reduced, whereas, on the contrary, a new law was certainly to be enacted providing for large and progressive increases, not only in 1912, but in the 5 following years. Practically 4/5 of the German Navy were to be placed permanently upon a war footing. The German government would be able to have available at all seasons of the year 25 or perhaps 29 fully commissioned battleships, whereas at the present time the British government have in full commission in home waters only 22, even counting the Atlantic Fleet. Thus, on the fundamental proposition, we encountered an unyielding attitude. Nevertheless, we persevered, and the discussion was transferred to the question of a mutual declaration against aggressive plans. Here, Sir Edward Grey offered the following formula: England will make no unprovoked attack upon Germany and pursue no aggressive policy towards her. Aggression upon Germany is not the subject and forms no part of any treaty, understanding, or combination to which England is now a party, nor will she become a party to anything that has such an object. The German government considered this formula inadequate and suggested through their ambassador the following additional clause: England will therefore observe at least a benevolent neutrality should war be forced upon Germany, or England will therefore, as a matter of course, remain neutral if a war is forced upon Germany. This last condition would have carried us far beyond our original intention, and might well have been held to deprive us of the power to come to the aid of France in a war forced, or alleged to be forced, upon Germany as the result of a quarrel between Austria and Russia. It would certainly have been regarded as terminating the Entente. Moreover, even if we had taken this step, the new German Navy law was not to be withdrawn. At the most, it was to be modified. Thus, a complete deadlock was reached at an early stage. Still, so important did we think it to create at least a friendly spirit, and so desirous were we of placating Germany and gratifying her aspirations, that we still persisted in an endeavor to come to an arrangement beneficial to Germany in the colonial sphere. These negotiations were still progressing and had almost reached a conclusion definitely advantageous to Germany when the war broke out. Lord Fisher did not like the idea of a naval program. On February 13, 1912, he wrote, "I can't support you at all in any way whatever for any 2 years or more program. Some damned fool has got hold of you to have made you say that. The great secret is to put off to the very last hour the ship, big or little, that you mean to build, or perhaps not build her at all. You see all your rivals' plans fully developed, their vessels started beyond recall, and then in each individual answer to each such rival vessel, you plunge with a design 50% better. Knowing that your rapid shipbuilding and command of money will enable you to have your vessel fit to fight as soon, if not sooner, than the rival vessel. Sometimes, as in one famous year, you can drop an armored ship and put the money into acceleration of those building because you have a new design coming along. So don't be a damned ass and deliberately lay down a ship which you know is obsolete by some sudden vast step in old Watt's brain. Sufficient for the year is the program thereof. For God's sake, get that written up somewhere for you to look at when you get out of bed in the morning, and do please tell me the name of the born fool who hoaxed you. Is it... He has just got a gold medal in America for advocating smaller battleships, I believe. You know Archbishop Whately proved that Napoleon Bonaparte never existed. We are asses now for not building a 16-inch gun, as Sir E. Wilmot told you in the letter I sent you. But you can't help yourself any more than you can help deliberately laying down ships for the line of battle that go less than 30 knots. There are certain things, my beloved Winston, that even God Almighty can't help, let alone you. He, for instance, can't help 2 added to 2 being 4. The most damnable thing in the world is a servile copyist. One of the 4 Nelsonic attributes is power of initiative, and plunge is the watchword of progress. But I sicken you with my reiteration, so goodbye. I replied on February 19th. I am delighted to see your handwriting again. I had begun to fear the well of truth and inspiration was running dry. Do not, however, shut your mind against a program. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and I have been agreed on this policy ever since 1909, and I am quite certain that it can be developed so as to secure the greatest advantages without any sacrifice of elasticity. Such a program as I have in mind will cover the whole period of the existing German Navy law. It will deal only with the numbers of capital ships. It will be framed on certain clearly defined assumptions. It will be capable both of expansion and diminution, of retardation and acceleration. It will not necessarily be embodied in an Act of Parliament. It will probably have to be revised after 4 years. It will recite certain definite facts of the existing shipbuilding situation, particularly in relation to Germany and Austria. It will be measured in relation to these facts so as to secure ample margins of superiority both in new construction and in establishment over those powers. Unforeseen contingencies will be met by additions, but it would always be open within certain limits for England and Germany to agree upon proportionate reductions. The program of minor construction will be entirely flexible and expressed only in terms of money. At present, we suffer every disadvantage, a panic and a row every year, spasmodic building, hopeless finance, total lack of foresight in regard to the labor market, and no means of bargaining with our competitors. At present, we have nothing to put against their threats. Nothing, in my opinion, would more surely dishearten Germany than the certain proof that as the result of all her present and prospective efforts, she will only be more hopelessly behindhand in 1920. She would know it was not bluff because if a liberal government could propose it, a Tory government would a fortiori carry it further. The vast financial reserves of which John Bull can dispose would come into view and would weigh in the balance with a direct and real weight. It is the uncertainty as to whether we shall throw up the sponge or not, on which the German Navy has lived and fattened. The standard will be 60% preponderance in new construction against the present law, and 2 keels to 1 for all increases above it. 60% preponderance in men, 20 to 12 in destroyers, at least 2 to 1 in armored cruisers, protected cruisers and their equivalents, submarines, and small fry generally. This is no new idea of mine. I have been working it out ever since I came to the Admiralty, and am absolutely convinced that it is the only way of securing economy, efficiency, and moral effect. Whether the plan when made should be published is a political question. How Navy estimates should be financed is for the Treasury and the House of Commons to decide. What the Admiralty are concerned with is the maintenance of proper margins of superiority, the power to look ahead, and the power within certain prescribed limits to maneuver. Hopwood and Sir Marcus Samuel are hard at it over oil. This letter mollified the Admiral. On the 25th February 1912, he wrote, "I hasten to reply to your letter of February 19th, just arrived, because if your program, which has my enthusiastic admiration, is not embodied in an Act of Parliament, then all my objections vanish. An Act of Parliament, the Naval Defense Act, made us build 20 cruisers that had only 48 hours coal supply. Can I ever forget that? But Providence came along and made them useful as mine layers. However, ocean tramps at $10 a ton would have been cheaper and more effective. Sir W. White built the County class and forgot the guns, but Providence came along and has made them useful for commerce protectors with their 6-inch guns and big coal supply and good speed. However, a few Mauritanias would be far more effective than 100 counties. I can only pray that your program will be officially published, for it is sure to leak out. It will add immensely to your reputation and influence, and the moral effect will be prodigious. The key note is 2 keels to 1 for all increases above the present German law. 2 to 1 in armored cruisers is also vital. You don't say a word of your visit to Jellicoe, but he does. He is much impressed with your grasp of the whole business. And as Jellicoe very seldom indeed gives praise, I think you must have talked well. As that night we stumbled over the dockyard stores at Devonport, returning from the Lion and the Monarch. It's a pity we didn't have a shorthand writer. Don't make any mistake about big submarines being obligatory. Big risks bring big success. It was Napoleon, wasn't it? Risk nothing, get nothing. Increased surface speed is above all a necessity, and broadside torpedo discharges and the bigger gun will come automatically with the above 2 essentials, and they, the big submarines, will be destroyers with all the advantages of the present destroyers and, as well, the power of submergence during daylight attacks. Battle tactics will be revolutionized, and England's power will be multiplied not 7-fold, but manifold, and with a radius of action of 6,000 miles. But it wants an Isaiah to proclaim this vision. For God's sake, trample on and stamp out protected cruisers and hurry up aviation. For a specimen of Fisher's genius, I commend these last few lines. 10 years of submarine development, spurred on by war on the greatest scale, were required to overtake in exact sequence the processes of that amazing vision in technical affairs. The consequences to Great Britain were, however, not so satisfactory as he forecasted. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Chapter 5, Part 2 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill. The German Navy Law, 1912. Early in March, while the new German Navy Law was still unannounced, it was necessary to present our estimates to the House of Commons. It would, of course, have been a breach of faith with the German Emperor to let any suggestion pass my lips that we already knew what the text of the Navy Law was. I was therefore obliged to make my first speech on naval matters on a purely hypothetical basis. This is what we are going to do if no further increases are made in the German fleet. Should, unhappily, the rumors of which we hear prove true, I shall have to present a supplementary estimate to the House, etc. In this speech, I laid down clearly, with the assent of the Cabinet, the principles which should govern our naval construction in the next 5 years, and the standards of strength we should follow in capital ships. This standard was as follows: 60% in dreadnoughts over Germany as long as she adhered to her present declared program, and 2 keels to 1 for every additional ship laid down by her. 2 complications of these clear principles were unavoidable. First, the 2 Lord Nelsons, although not dreadnoughts, were stronger in many ways, particularly in armor and subdivision, than the original dreadnought herself. Although projected earlier, they had actually been completed later. Acting on the advice of the Naval Staff, I counted these throughout as dreadnoughts. On the other hand, any ships provided by the Dominions were to be additional to anything we might build ourselves. Otherwise, the efforts of the Dominions would not have resulted in any accession to our naval strength, and consequently these efforts might have been discouraged. Proceeding on these lines, I set out the 6 years of British construction at 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, against a uniform German construction of 2. These numbers were well received by the House of Commons. We were not sure whether the Germans would adhere to an offer made to Mr. Haldane to drop one of the 3 extra ships embodied in their new Navy Law. This, however, proved ultimately to be the case, and was at any rate a tangible result of the Haldane mission. In Tirpitz's words, he, Haldane, next came out with a proposal of a certain delay in the building of the 3 ships. Could we not distribute them over 12 years? He only wanted a token of our readiness to meet England, more for the sake of form. Haldane himself proposed that we should retard the rate of our increase in order to lubricate the negotiations, or that we should at least cancel the first of the 3 ships. He outlined in writing of his own accord the same principle which I had previously fixed upon in my own mind as a possible concession. I therefore sacrificed the ship. We therefore sacrificed 2 hypothetical ships, and our programs, which would have been increased to 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, were ultimately declared at 4, 5, 4, 4, 4, 4. The splendid gift of the Malaya by the Federated Malay States raised the figure of the first year from 4 to 5. In announcing these decisions to Parliament later in the same month, I made publicly and definitely those proposals for a naval holiday which were fruitless so far as Britain and Germany were concerned, but the principle of which has since been adopted by the English-speaking peoples of the world. Take as an instance of this proposition, I am putting forward for general consideration the year 1913. In that year, as I apprehend, Germany will build 3 capital ships, and it will be necessary for us to build 5 in consequence. Supposing we were both to take a holiday for that year and introduce a blank page into the book of misunderstanding, supposing that Germany were to build no ships that year, she would save herself between 6 and 7 millions sterling. But that is not all. In ordinary circumstances, we should not begin our ships until Germany had started hers. The 3 ships that she did not build would therefore automatically wipe out no fewer than 5 British potential super-dreadnoughts. That is more than I expect they could hope to do in a brilliant naval action. As to the indirect results within a single year, they simply cannot be measured, not only between our 2 great brother nations, but to all the world. They are results immeasurable in their hope and brightness. This, then, is the position which we take up, that the Germans will be no gainers over us so far as naval power is concerned by any increases they may make, and no losers, on the basis I have laid down, by any diminution. By the beginning of April, it became certain that no general arrangement for a naval holiday could be effected with Germany. The Emperor sent me a courteous message through Sir Ernest Cassell expressing his great regret, but adding that such arrangements would only be possible between allies. Herr Ballon wrote at the same time to Sir Ernest, "I entirely share your opinion of C.'s Churchill's speech, and believe that it is simply the unusual feature of frankness and honesty which flustered the whole world, and especially the leading parties here, and has caused a torrent of indignation in the press. It is not easy to become all at once accustomed to such a complete change from the mystery-mongering hitherto prevalent. Up to now, it was thought that language was given to British and German Navy ministers to conceal their thoughts. Suddenly, someone makes a new departure, and everybody asks disconcertedly, "What does this man want?" A few friendly lines addressed to you about the report I sent would have a happy effect. A complaint which we were reputed to have made about an alleged clandestine visit of certain German ships to the Shetland Islands. If he wishes it, C can make use of this opportunity in a few quite unofficial lines addressed to you, to brush away the shadows which were created in high quarters here by the luxury fleet, Luxus Flot, and the absence of warmth in his last speech. This will be a great help in the political negotiations. It would be too pitiful if, owing to misunderstanding and sentiment, the great work of arrangement were to be hindered, etc., etc. In compliance, I therefore wrote the following letter for the Emperor's eye. Mr. Churchill to Sir Ernest Cassell, April 14th, 1912. I am deeply impressed by the Emperor's great consideration. I only mentioned the incident to Ballon as an example to show the kind of anxieties and the strain to which the naval situation gives rise. I am very glad to know that it was free from all sinister significance, and I take this opportunity of saying again that we have been throughout equally innocent of any offensive design. I suppose it is difficult for either country to realize how formidable it appears to the eyes of the other. Certainly it must be almost impossible for Germany, with her splendid armies and warlike population capable of holding their native soil against all comers, and situated inland with road and railway communications on every side, to appreciate the sentiments with which an island state like Britain views the steady and remorseless development of a rival naval power of the very highest efficiency. The more we admire the wonderful work that has been done in the swift creation of German naval strength, the stronger, the deeper, and the more preoccupying those sentiments become. Patience, however, and good temper accomplish much, and as the years pass, many difficulties and dangers seem to settle themselves peacefully. Meanwhile, there is an anxious defile to be traversed, and what will help more perhaps than anything else to make the journey safe for us all is the sincere desire for goodwill and confidence of which Ballin's letter and its enclosure are a powerful testimony. The growth of the German Navy produced its inevitable consequences. The British fleet, for safety's sake, had to be concentrated in home waters. The first concentration had been made by Lord Fisher in 1904. This had effected the reduction of very large numbers of small old vessels, which were scattered about the world, showing the flag, and the formation in their place of stronger, better, more homogeneous squadrons at home. This measure was also a great and wise economy of money. A few months later, the British battleships were recalled from China. The more distant oceans had thus been abandoned, but now a further measure of concentration was required. We saw ourselves compelled to withdraw the battleships from the Mediterranean. Only by this measure could the trained men be obtained to form the 3rd Battle Squadron in full commission in home waters. It was decided by the Cabinet that we must still maintain a powerful force in the Mediterranean, and ultimately 4 battle cruisers and an armored cruiser squadron were accordingly based on Malta. It was further decided that a dreadnought battle squadron should also be developed in the Mediterranean by the year 1916, equal in strength to that of the growing Austrian battle fleet. These decisions were taken with the deliberate object of regaining our complete independence. But the withdrawal, even if only for a few years, of the battleships from the Mediterranean was a noteworthy event. It made us appear to be dependent upon the French fleet in those waters. The French also at the same time redisposed their forces. Under the growing pressure of German armaments, Britain transferred her whole battle fleet to the North Sea, and France moved all her heavy ships into the Mediterranean. And the sense of mutual reliance grew swiftly between both navies. It is astonishing that Admiral von Tirpitz should never have comprehended what the consequences of his policy must be. Even after the war, he could write, "In order to estimate the strength of the trump card which our fleet put in the hands of an energetic diplomacy at this time, one must remember that in consequence of the concentration of the English forces which we had caused in the North Sea, the English control of the Mediterranean and far eastern waters had practically ceased. The only trump card which Germany secured by this policy was the driving of Britain and France closer and closer together. From the moment that the fleets of France and Britain were disposed in this new way, our common naval interests became very important, and the moral claims which France could make upon Great Britain if attacked by Germany, whatever we had stipulated to the contrary, were enormously extended. Indeed, my anxiety was aroused to try to prevent this necessary recall of our ships from tying us up too tightly with France and depriving us of that liberty of choice on which our power to stop a war might well depend. When in August 1912, the Cabinet decided that naval conversations should take place between the French and British Admiralties, similar to those which had been held since 1906 between the General Staffs, I set forth this point as clearly as possible in a minute which I addressed to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and we did our utmost to safeguard ourselves. August 23rd, 1912. Sir Edward Grey, Prime Minister. The point I am anxious to safeguard is our freedom of choice if the occasion arises, and consequent power to influence French policy beforehand. That freedom will be sensibly impaired if the French can say that they have denuded their Atlantic seaboard and concentrated in the Mediterranean on the faith of naval arrangements made with us. This will not be true. If we did not exist, the French could not make better dispositions than at present. They are not strong enough to face Germany alone, still less to maintain themselves in two theaters. They therefore rightly concentrate their navy in the Mediterranean, where it can be safe and superior and can assure their African communications. Neither is it true that we are relying on France to maintain our position in the Mediterranean. If France did not exist, we should make no other disposition of our forces. Circumstances might arise which, in my judgment, would make it desirable and right for us to come to the aid of France with all our force by land and sea. But we ask nothing in return. If we were attacked by Germany, we should not make it a charge of bad faith against the French that they left us to fight it out alone. And nothing in naval and military arrangements ought to have the effect of exposing us to such a charge if, when the time comes, we decide to stand out. This is my view, and I am sure I am in line with you on the principle. I am not at all particular how it is to be given effect to, and I make no point about what document it is set forth in. But consider how tremendous would be the weapon which France would possess to compel our intervention if she could say, "On the advice of and by arrangement with your naval authorities, we have left our northern coasts defenseless. We cannot possibly come back in time." Indeed, I added somewhat inconsequently, it would probably be decisive, whatever is written down now. Everyone must feel who knows the facts that we have the obligations of an alliance without its advantages, and above all, without its precise definitions. W.S.C. The difficulty proved a real one. The technical naval discussions could only be conducted on the basis that the French fleet should be concentrated in the Mediterranean, and that in case of a war in which both countries took part, it would fall to the British fleet to defend the northern and western coasts of France. The French, as I had foreseen, naturally raised the point that if Great Britain did not take part in the war, their northern and western coasts would be completely exposed. We, however, while recognizing the difficulty, steadfastly declined to allow the naval arrangements to bind us in any political sense. It was eventually agreed that if there was a menace of war, the two governments should consult together and concert beforehand what common actions, if any, they should take. The French were obliged to accept this position and to affirm definitely that the naval conversations did not involve any obligation of common action. This was the best we could do for ourselves and for them. I commend these discussions and the document I have printed above to German eyes. The German naval minister exults in a policy which has had the effect of uniting in common defense against Germany, in spite of themselves, two powerful fleets till then rivals. The British ministers, so far from welcoming this consolidation of forces in the opposite balance to Germany, are anxious to preserve their freedom of action and reluctant to become entangled with continental powers. Germany was, in fact, forging a coalition against herself, and Britain was seeking to save her from the consequences of her unwisdom. It is not often that one can show so plainly the workings of events, but all was lost on Admiral von Tirpitz. This sincere, wrong-headed, purblind old Prussian firmly believed that the growth of his beloved navy was inducing in British minds an increasing fear of war, whereas it simply produced naval rejoinders and diplomatic reactions which strengthened the forces and closed the ranks of the Entente. It is almost pathetic to read the foolish sentences in which, on page after page of his memoirs, he describes how much Anglo-German relations were improved in 1912, 1913, and 1914 through the realization by the British people of Germany's great and growing naval power. He notices that the violent agitations against German naval expansion, which swept England in 1904 and again in 1908, were succeeded by a comparatively calm period in which both powers were building peacefully and politely against each other. This, he thinks, was a proof that his treatment was succeeding and that all friction was passing away. Another dose or two, and it would be gone altogether. The violent agitations in England were, however, the symptom of doubt and differences of opinion in our national life about whether the German menace was real or not, and whether the right measures were being taken to meet it. As doubts and differences on these points were gradually replaced by general agreement among the leading men in all parties to meet a grave danger, the agitations subsided. The excitement in the press and in Parliament, the warning speeches and counter-speeches, were not intended for foreign consumption. England was not trying to make an impression upon Germany. She was trying to make up her own mind, and in proportion as this mind arrived at solid and final conclusions, silence was again restored. But it was not the silence of sleep. With every rivet that von Tirpitz drove into his ships of war, he united British opinion throughout wide circles of the most powerful people in every walk of life and in every part of the empire. The hammers that clanged at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven were forging the coalition of nations by which Germany was to be resisted and finally overthrown. Every threatening gesture that she made, every attempt to shock or shake the loosely knit structure of the Entente, made it close and fit together more tightly. Thus Tirpitz. British statesmen naturally did not stress the fact in their conversations with Germans that it was mainly the presence of our nearly completed fleet in the North Sea that had produced their respectful tone and had lessened the probability of a British attack. Of course, they only spoke of their peaceful inclinations and not so much of the facts which strengthened these inclinations. And again, page 192, 17 years of fleet building had, it is true, improved the prospects of an acceptable peace with England. Is it possible to be further from the truth than this? There never had been any probability or possibility of a British attack on Germany. Why should we attack Germany for building ships when we could ourselves build more ships quicker and cheaper? Why incur the guilt, cost, and hazard of war when a complete remedy was obvious and easy? But the respectful tone was that of men who felt how serious the position had become and were anxious to avoid any responsibility for causing a crisis. It was not restraint imposed by fear of the nearly completed fleet in the North Sea, but the calm resulting from resolve to be prepared. The organization of a fleet differs throughout from that of an army. Armies only keep a small proportion of their soldiers in regular service. These form the framework of the battalions, train the recruits, and keep guard in times of peace. When the order is given to mobilize, all the men who have been already trained but are living at home in civil life are called up as they are wanted, and then, and not till then, the army is ready to fight. Navies, on the other hand, were in the main always ready. The British Navy had all its best ships fully and permanently manned with whole-time men, called active service ratings. Measured by quality, nearly the whole of its power was therefore constantly available. Measured even by numbers, nearly 3/4 of the ships could go into action without calling out the reserves. Only the oldest and most obsolete ships were manned in time of war by the Naval Reserve, that is to say, men who had left the Navy and had returned to civil life. These obsolete vessels were the only part of the fleet which had to be mobilized, like the armies of Europe. Thus, mobilization, which is the foundation of all great armies, plays only a very small part in fleets. Every ship that really counted was always ready to steam and fight as soon as an order reached her. The organization of the British home fleets when I came to the Admiralty seemed to a mind accustomed to military symmetry to leave much to be desired. The terminology was misleading and confused. The word division was used in 3 different senses, sometimes tactical and sometimes administrative. The battle units were uneven in numbers. The degree of readiness and efficiency of the different squadrons was not apparent from the classes in which they were grouped. In consultation with Sir Francis Bridgeman, Prince Louis, and Admiral Trowbridge, the first chief of the new war staff, I designed a new and symmetrical organization for the fleets. All the ships available for home defense were divided into the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd fleets, comprising 8 battle squadrons of 8 battleships each, together with their attendant cruiser squadrons, flotillas, and auxiliaries. The 1st Fleet comprised a fleet flagship and 4 battle squadrons of ships in full commission, manned entirely with active service ratings, and therefore always ready. To form this fleet, it was necessary to base the former Atlantic Fleet on home ports instead of on Gibraltar, and to base the battleships hitherto in the Mediterranean on Gibraltar instead of Malta. By this concentration, an additional battle squadron of strong ships, King Edward's, was always ready in home waters. The 2nd Fleet consisted of 2 battle squadrons, also fully manned with active service ratings, but having about 40% of these learning and requalifying in the gunnery, torpedo, and other schools. This fleet was termed inactive commission because it could fight at any moment, but to realize its highest efficiency, it required to touch at its home ports and march on board its balanced crews from the schools. In all these 6 battle squadrons, containing with their cruiser squadrons every modern and middle-aged ship in the Navy, there was not to be found a single reservist. No mobilization was therefore necessary to bring the whole of this force into action. The 3rd Fleet also consisted of 2 battle squadrons and 5 cruiser squadrons of our oldest ships. These were only manned by care and maintenance parties and required the reserves to be called out before they could put out to sea. In order to accelerate the mobilization of the leading battle squadrons and certain cruisers of the 3rd Fleet, a special class of the reserve was now formed, called the Immediate Reserve, who received higher pay and periodical training and were liable to be called up in advance of general mobilization. Germany was adding a 3rd squadron to the High Sea Fleet, thus increasing her always-ready strength from 17 to 25. We, in reply, by the measures set out above and various others too technical for description here, raised our always-ready fleet from 33 battleships to 49, and other forces in like proportion. On mobilization, the German figures would rise to 38, and the British at first to 57, and ultimately, as the new organization was completed, to 65. The reader will not be able to understand the issues involved in the completion and mobilization of the fleets on the eve of the war unless this organization is mastered. We made a great assembly of the Navy this spring of 1912 at Portland. The flags of a dozen admirals, the broad pennants of as many commodores, and the pennants of 150 ships were flying together. The King came in the royal yacht, the Admiralty flag at the fore, the standard at the main, and the jack at the mizzen, and bided among his sailors for 4 days. One day there is a long cruise out into mist, dense, utterly baffling, the whole fleet steaming together all invisible, keeping station by weird siren screamings and hootings. It seemed incredible that no harm would befall. And then suddenly the fog lifted, and the distant targets could be distinguished, and the whole long line of battleships, coming one after another into view, burst into tremendous flares of flame and hurled their shells with deafening detonations while the water rose in tall fountains. The fleet returns, 3 battle squadrons abreast, cruisers and flotillas disposed ahead and astern. The speed is raised to 20 knots. Streaks of white foam appear at the bows of every vessel. The land draws near. The broad bay already embraces this swiftly moving gigantic armada. The ships in their formation already fill the bay. The foreign officers I have with me on the Enchantress bridge stare anxiously. We still steam fast. 5 minutes more and the van of the fleet will be aground. 4 minutes. 3 minutes. There, at last, the signal. A string of bright flags falls from the Neptune's halyards. Every anchor falls together. Their cables roar through the hawser holes. Every propeller whirls astern. In 150 yards, every ship is stationary. Look along the lines, miles this way and miles that. They might have been drawn with a ruler. The foreign observers gasped. These were great days. From dawn to midnight, day after day, one's whole mind was absorbed by the fascination and novelty of the problems which came crowding forward. And all the time there was a sense of power to act, to form, to organize. All the ablest officers in the Navy standing ready, loyal and eager, with argument, guidance, information. Every one feeling a sense that a great danger had passed very near us, that there was a breathing space before it would return, that we must be even better prepared next time. Saturdays, Sundays, and any other spare day I spent always with the fleets at Portsmouth or at Portland or Devonport, or with the flotillas at Harwich. Officers of every rank came on board to lunch or dine, and discussion proceeded without ceasing on every aspect of naval war and administration. The Admiralty yacht Enchantress was now to become largely my office, almost my home, and my work my sole occupation and amusement. In all, I spent 8 months afloat in the 3 years before the war. I visited every dockyard, shipyard, and naval establishment in the British Isles and in the Mediterranean and every important ship. I examined for myself every point of strategic importance and every piece of Admiralty property. I got to know what everything looked like and where everything was, and how one thing fitted into another. In the end, I could put my hand on anything that was wanted and knew thoroughly the current state of our naval affairs. I recall vividly my first voyage from Portsmouth to Portland, where the fleet lay. A gray afternoon was drawing to a close. As I saw the fleet for the first time drawing out of the haze, a friend reminded me of that far-off line of storm-beaten ships on which the eyes of the Grand Army had never looked, but which had in their day stood between Napoleon and the dominion of the world. In Portland Harbor, the yacht lay surrounded by the great ships. The whole harbor was alive with the goings and comings of launches and small craft of every kind, and as night fell, 10,000 lights from sea and shore sprang into being, and every masthead twinkled as the ships and squadrons conversed with one another. Who could fail to work for such a service? Who could fail when the very darkness seemed loaded with the menace of approaching war? For consider these ships, so vast in themselves, yet so small, so easily lost to sight on the surface of the waters. Sufficient at the moment, we trusted, for their task, but yet only a score or so. They were all we had. On them, as we conceived, floated the might, majesty, dominion, and power of the British Empire. All our long history built up century after century, all our great affairs in every part of the globe, all the means of livelihood and safety of our faithful, industrious, active population depended upon them. Open the seacocks and let them sink beneath the surface, as another fleet was one day to do in another British harbor far to the north, and in a few minutes, half an hour at the most, the whole outlook of the world would be changed. The British Empire would dissolve like a dream. Each isolated community struggling forward by itself, the central power of union broken, mighty provinces, whole empires in themselves, drifting hopelessly out of control and falling a prey to others, and Europe, after one sudden convulsion, passing into the iron grip and rule of the Teuton and of all that the Teutonic system meant. There would only be left far off across the Atlantic unarmed, unready, and as yet uninstructed America to maintain, single-handed, law and freedom among men. Guard them well, admirals and captains, hardy tars and tall marines. Guard them well and guide them true. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. Chapter 6, Part 1 of The World Crisis, Volume 1, by Winston Churchill, The Romance of Design. For a scrutiny so minute as to bring an object under an untrue angle of vision is a poorer guide to a man's judgment than the most rapid and sweeping glance which sees things in their true proportions. Kinglake. The big punch, the 15-inch gun, an anxious decision, the design of a battleship, gun power and speed, the argument for the fast division, the fifth turret, liquid fuel, the oil problem, financial entanglements, the Royal Commission on Oil Supplies, the Anglo-Persian Convention, a golden reward, the fast division at Jutland, swifter destroyers, cruiser design, correspondence with Lord Fisher, the light armored cruisers, the Arethusa. Until I got to the Admiralty, I had never properly appreciated the service which Mr. McKenna and Lord Fisher had rendered to the fleet in 1909 by their big leap forward from the 12-inch to the 13.5-inch gun. To illustrate this, I set out the weight of the shell fired by the principal guns in the British and German navies. The 1-inch gun fires a 1-pound shot. The 2-inch gun fires a 6-pound shot. The 3-inch gun fires a 12 or 15-pound shot. The 4-inch gun fires a 28 to 32-pound shot. The 5-inch gun fires a 50-pound shot. The 6-inch gun fires a 100-pound shot. The 7.5-inch gun fires a 200-pound shot. The 9.2-inch gun fires a 380-pound shot. The 10-inch gun fires a 500-pound shot. The British 12-inch gun fires a 850-pound shot. The German 12-inch gun fires approximately a 1,000-pound shot, but this is asking a lot of the gun. The 13.5-inch gun fired a 1,250-pound shot, and its later marks fired a 1,400-pound shot. The increase of 1.5 inch in the caliber of the gun was enough to raise the British shell from 850 pounds to 1,400 pounds. No fewer than 12 ships were actually building on the slips for the Royal Navy armed with these splendid weapons, quite unsurpassed at that time in the world, and firing a projectile nearly half as heavy again as the biggest fired by the German fleet. I immediately sought to go one size better. I mentioned this to Lord Fisher at Reigate, and he hurled himself into its advocacy with tremendous passion. Nothing less than the 15-inch gun could be looked at for all the battleships and battle cruisers of the new program. To achieve the supply of this gun was the equivalent of a great victory at sea. To shrink from the endeavor was treason to the Empire. What was it that enabled Jack Johnson to knock out his opponents? It was the big punch. And where were those miserable men with bevies of futile pop guns crowding up their ships? No one who has not experienced it has any idea of the passion and eloquence of this old lion when thoroughly roused on a technical question. I resolved to make a great effort to secure the prize, but the difficulties and the risks were very great, and looking back upon it, one feels that they were only justified by success. Enlarging the gun meant enlarging the ships, and enlarging the ships meant increasing the cost. Moreover, the redesign must cause no delay, and the guns must be ready as soon as the turrets were ready. No such thing as a modern 15-inch gun existed. None had ever been made. The advance to the 13.5-inch had in itself been a great stride. Its power was greater, its accuracy was greater, its life was much longer. Could the British designers repeat this triumph on a still larger scale and in a still more intense form? The Ordnance Board were set to work, and they rapidly produced a design. Armstrongs were consulted in deadly secrecy, and they undertook to execute it. I had anxious conferences with these experts, with whose science I was, of course, wholly unacquainted, to see what sort of men they were and how they really felt about it. They were all for it. One did not need to be an expert in ballistics to discern that. The Director of Naval Ordnance, Rear Admiral Moore, was ready to stake his professional existence upon it. But, after all, there could not be absolute certainty. We knew the 13.5-inch well. All sorts of new stresses might develop in the 15-inch model. If only we could make a trial gun and test it thoroughly before giving the orders for the whole of the guns of all the 5 ships, there would be no risk. But then we should lose an entire year, and 5 great vessels would go into the line of battle carrying an inferior weapon to that which we had it in our power to give them. Several there were of the responsible authorities consulted who thought it would be more prudent to lose the year. For, after all, if the guns had failed, the ships would have been fearfully marred. I hardly remember ever to have had more anxiety about any administrative decision than this. I went back to Lord Fisher. He was steadfast and even violent, so I hardened my heart and took the plunge. The whole outfit of guns was ordered forthwith. We arranged that one gun should be hurried on 4 months in front of the others by exceptional efforts so as to be able to test it for range and accuracy and to get out the range tables and other complex devices which depended upon actual firing results. From this moment, we were irrevocably committed to the whole armament, and every detail in these vessels, extending to thousands of parts, was redesigned to fit them. Fancy if they failed. What a disaster! What an exposure! No excuse would be accepted. It would all be brought home to me, rash, inexperienced, before he had been there a month, altering all the plans of his predecessors and producing this ghastly fiasco, the mutilation of all the ships of the year. What could I have said? Moreover, although the decision, once taken, was irrevocable, a long period of suspense, 14 or 15 months at least, was unavoidable. However, I dissembled my misgivings. I wrote to the First Sea Lord that risks have to be run in peace as well as in war, and courage in design now may win a battle later on. But everything turned out all right. British gunnery science proved exact and true, and British workmanship as sound as a bell and punctual to the day. The first gun was known in the Elswick shop as the Hush and Push gun, and was invariably described in all official documents as the 14-inch experimental. It proved a brilliant success. It hurled a 1,920-pound projectile 35,000 yards. It achieved remarkable accuracy at all ranges without shortening its existence by straining itself in any way. No doubt I was unduly anxious, but when I saw the gun fired for the first time a year later and knew that all was well, I felt as if I had been delivered from a great peril. In one of those nightmare novels that used to appear from time to time before the war, I read in 1913 of a great battle in which, to the amazement of the defeated British fleet, the German new vessels opened fire with a terrible, unheard-of 15-inch gun. There was a real satisfaction in feeling that anyhow this boot was on the other leg. The gun dominated the ship and was the decisive cause of all the changes we then made in design. The following was in those days the recipe in very unexpert language for making a battleship. You take the largest possible number of the best possible guns that can be fired in combination from one vessel as a single battery. You group them conveniently by pairs in turrets. You put the turrets so that there is the widest possible arc of fire for every gun and the least possible blast interference. This regulates the position of the turrets and the spacing between them. You draw a line around the arrangement of turrets thus arrived at, which gives you the deck of the ship. You then build a hull to carry this deck or great gun platform. It must be very big and very long. Next, you see what room you have got inside this hull for engines to drive it, and from this and from the length you get the speed. Last of all, you decide on the armor. All these calculations and considerations act and react upon one another at every stage, and the manner in which the Royal Corps of Constructors can juggle with these factors, and the facility with which the great chiefs and masters of battleship design, like Sir Philip Watts and Sir Eustace Tennyson d'Eyncourt, and their faithful confederate, Sir Henry Oram, the chief engineer, were able to speak on these matters were marvelous beyond belief. In a few hours, or at most in a few days, one could be told the effect of an alteration in any one set of conditions upon every other set of conditions. On this vast process of juggling and higgling we now embarked. From the beginning there appeared a ship carrying 10 15-inch guns, and therefore at least 600 feet long, with room inside her for engines which would drive her 21 knots, and capacity to carry armor which, on the armored belt, the turrets, and the conning tower, would reach the thickness, unprecedented in the British service, of 13 inches. For less armor, you could have more speed. For less speed, you could have more armor, and so on within very considerable limits. But now a new idea began to dawn. 8 15-inch guns would fire a simultaneous broadside of approximately 16,000 pounds. 10 of the latest 13.5-inch would only fire 14,000 pounds. Therefore, we could get, for 8 15-inch guns, a punch substantially greater than that of 10 13.5-inch. Nor did the superiority end there. With the increased size of the shell came a far greater increase in the capacity of the bursting charge. It was not quite a geometric progression, because other considerations intervened, but it was in that order of ideas. There was no doubt about the punch. On the other hand, look at the speed. 21 knots was all very well in its way, but suppose we could get a much greater speed. Suppose we could cram into the hull a horsepower sufficient to drive these terrific vessels, already possessing guns and armor superior to that of the heaviest battleship, at speeds hitherto only obtained by the lightly armored 12-inch gun battle cruisers. Should we not have introduced a new element into naval war? And here we leave the region of material. I have built the process up stage by stage as it was argued out, but of course all the processes proceeded in simultaneous relation, and the result was to show a great possibility. Something like the ship described above could be made if it were wanted. Was it wanted? Was it the right thing to make? Was its tactical value sufficient to justify the increase in cost and all the changes in design? We must turn for the answer to the tactical sphere. Here I felt able to see a little more clearly. As cannot be too often repeated, war is all one, and the same principles of thought which are true in any form are true, mutatis mutandis, in every other form. Obviously, in creating an army or an air force or a squadron of battleships, you must first of all have regard to their highest tactical employment, namely, decisive battle. Let us, therefore, first of all, visualize the battle. Let us try to imagine what its conditions will be, what we shall have to meet, and what would help us most to win. The first naval idea of our supreme battle at this time was that it would be fought about something. Somebody would want to be going somewhere, and somebody else would try to stop him. One of the fleets would be proceeding in a certain direction, and the other fleet would come along and try to prevent it. However they might approach, the battle would soon resolve itself into two lines of ships steaming along parallel and bringing all their broadsides to bear upon each other. Of course, if one fleet is much stronger than the other, has heavier guns, and shoots better, the opposite line begins to get the worst of it. Ships begin to burn and blow up and fall out of the line, and every one that falls out increases the burden of fire upon the remainder. The fleet, which has more ships in it, also has a tail which overlaps the enemy, and a good many ships in this tail can concentrate their fire upon the rear ships of the enemy, so that these unlucky vessels have not only to fight the ships opposite to them, but have to bear the fire of a number of others firing obliquely at them from behind. But smashing up the tail of an enemy's fleet is a poor way of preventing him from achieving his objective, i.e., going where he wants to go.
It is not comparable to smashing up his head. Injuries at the head of the line tend to throw the whole line into confusion, whereas injuries at the tail only result in the ships dropping astern without causing other complications. Therefore, the Admiralissimo will always try to draw a little ahead if he possibly can and bring his van nearer and nearer to the enemy, and gradually, if he can, force that enemy to turn off, so that he can then curl around him. This well-known maneuver is called crossing the T, and Admiral Togo had used it in the Battle of the Sea of Japan. If the speeds of the fleets are equal, how can this be done? The heads of both lines will be abreast, and the fire will only be given and returned ship for ship. But suppose you have a division of ships in your fleet which go much faster than any of your other ships or of your enemy's ships. These ships will be certainly able to draw ahead and curl around the head of the enemy's line. More than that, as they draw ahead, they will repeat in a much more effective fashion the advantage of an overlapping tail, because the ships at the head of the enemy's line will have to bear the fire of the overlapping ships as well as the fire of those which are lying opposite to them, and therefore 2 or 3 ships might be firing on every one of the leading ships of the enemy, thus smashing to pieces the head of the enemy's line and throwing his whole formation into confusion. Here, then, in simple outline, is the famous argument for the fast division. A squadron of ships possessing a definite superiority of speed could be so disposed in the approaching formation of your own fleet as to enable you, whichever way the enemy might deploy, to double the fire after certain interval upon the head of his line, and also to envelop it and cross it, and so force him into a circular movement and bring him to bay once and for all, without hope of escape. Hitherto, in all our battle plans, this role had been assigned to the battle cruisers. Their speed would certainly enable them to get there, but we must imagine that they would also be met by the enemy's battle cruisers, whereupon, as they say in the reports of the House of Commons debate arising, they might easily fight a separate action of their own without relation to the supreme conflict. Further, the battle cruisers, our beautiful cats, as their squadron was irreverently called, had thin skins compared to the enemy's strongest battleships, which presumably would head his line. It is a rough game to pit battle cruisers against battleships with only 7 or 9 inches of armor against 12 or 13, and probably with a weaker gun power as well. Suppose, however, we could make a division of ships fast enough to seize the advantageous position, and yet as strong in gun power and armor as any battleship afloat. Should we not have scored almost with certainty an inestimable and a decisive advantage? The first Sea Lord, Sir Francis Bridgeman, fresh from the command of the home fleet, and most of his principal officers, certainly thought so. The fast division was the dream of their battle plans. But could we get such ships? Could they be designed and constructed? And here we came back again to Sir Philip Watts and Sir Henry Oram and the Ordnance Board and the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors. At this stage, the War College were asked to work out on the tactical board the number of knots superiority in speed required in a fast division in order to ensure this division being able to maneuver around the German fleet as it would be in the years 1914 and 1915. The answer was that if the fast division could steam in company 25 knots or better, they could do all that was necessary. We therefore wanted 4 or 5 knots additional speed. How were we to get it? With every knot, the amount of horsepower required is progressively greater. Our new ship would steam 21 knots, but to steam 25 to 26, she wanted 50,000 horsepower. 50,000 horsepower meant more boilers, and where could they be put? Why, obviously they could be put where the fifth turret would go, and having regard to the increased punch of the 15-inch gun, we could spare the fifth turret. But even this would not suffice. We could not get the power required to drive these ships at 25 knots except by the use of oil fuel. The advantages conferred by liquid fuel were inestimable. First, speed. In equal ships, oil gave a large excess of speed over coal. It enabled that speed to be attained with far greater rapidity. It gave 40% greater radius of action for the same weight of coal. It enabled a fleet to refuel at sea with great facility. An oil-burning fleet can, if need be and in calm weather, keep its station at sea, nourishing itself from tankers without having to send a quarter of its strength continually into harbor to coal, wasting fuel on the homeward and outward journey. The ordeal of coaling ship exhausted the whole ship's company. In wartime, it robbed them of their brief period of rest. It subjected everyone to extreme discomfort. With oil, a few pipes were connected with the shore or with a tanker, and the ship sucked in its fuel with hardly a man having to lift a finger. Less than half the number of stokers was needed to tend and clean the oil furnaces.
Oil could be stowed in spare places in a ship from which it would be impossible to bring coal.
As a coal ship used up her coal, increasingly large numbers of men had to be taken, if necessary from the guns, to shovel the coal from remote and inconvenient bunkers to bunkers nearer to the furnaces or to the furnaces themselves, thus weakening the fighting efficiency of the ship perhaps at the most critical moment in the battle. For instance, nearly 100 men were continually occupied in the Lion, shoveling coal from one steel chamber to another without ever seeing the light either of day or of the furnace fires. The use of oil made it possible in every type of vessel to have more gunpowder and more speed for less size or less cost. It alone made it possible to realize the high speeds in certain types which were vital to their tactical purpose. All these advantages were obtained simply by burning oil instead of coal under the boilers. Should it at any time become possible to abolish boilers altogether and explode the oil in the cylinders of internal combustion engines, every advantage would be multiplied tenfold. On my arrival at the Admiralty, we had already built or building 56 destroyers solely dependent on oil and 74 submarines which could only be driven by oil, and a proportion of oil was used to spray the coal furnaces of nearly all ships. We were not, however, dependent upon oil to such an extent as to make its supply a serious naval problem. To build any large additional number of oil-burning ships meant basing our naval supremacy upon oil. But oil was not found in appreciable quantities in our islands. If we required it, we must carry it by sea in peace or war from distant countries. We had, on the other hand, the finest supply of the best steam coal in the world, safe in our mines under our own hand. To change the foundation of the Navy from British coal to foreign oil was a formidable decision in itself. If it were taken, it must raise a whole series of intricate problems, all requiring heavy initial expense. First, there must be accumulated in Great Britain an enormous oil reserve, large enough to enable us to fight for many months, if necessary, without bringing in a single cargo of oil. To contain this reserve, enormous installations of tanks must be erected near the various naval ports. would they not be very vulnerable? Could they be protected? Could they be concealed or disguised? The word camouflage was not then known. Fleets of tankers had to be built to convey the oil from the distant oil fields across the oceans to the British Isles, and others of a different pattern to take it from our naval harbors to the fleets at sea. Owing to the systems of finance by which we had bound ourselves, we were not allowed to borrow even for capital or once-for-all expenditure. Every penny must be won from Parliament year by year, and constituted a definite addition to the inevitably rising and already fiercely challenged naval estimates. And beyond these difficulties loomed up the more intangible problems of markets and monopolies. The oil supplies of the world were in the hands of vast oil trusts under foreign control. To commit the Navy irrevocably to oil was indeed to take arms against a sea of troubles. Wave after wave, dark with storm, crested with foam, surged towards the harbor in which we still sheltered. Should we drive out into the teeth of the gale, or should we bide contented where we were? Yet beyond the breakers was a great hope. If we overcame the difficulties and surmounted the risks, we should be able to raise the whole power and efficiency of the Navy to a definitely higher level. Better ships, better crews, higher economies, more intense forms of war power. In a word, mastery itself was the prize of the venture. A year gained over a rival might make the difference. Forward, then. The three programs of 1912, 1913, and 1914 comprised the greatest additions in power and cost ever made to the Royal Navy. With the lamentable exception of the battleships of 1913, and these were afterwards corrected, they did not contain a coal-burning ship. Submarines, destroyers, light cruisers, fast battleships, all were based irrevocably on oil. The fateful plunge was taken when it was decided to create the fast division. Then, for the first time, the supreme ships of the Navy, on which our life depended, were fed by oil and could only be fed by oil. The decision to drive the smaller craft by oil followed naturally upon this. The camel once swallowed, the gnats went down easily enough. A decision like this involved our national safety as much as a battle at sea. It was as anxious and as harassing as any hazard in war. It was war in a certain sense, raging under a surface of unbroken peace. Compare it with the decision to attempt to force the Dardanelles with the old surplus vessels of a fleet which had already proved its supremacy. The oil decision was vital. The Dardanelles decision was subsidiary. The first touched our existence, the second our superfluities. Having succeeded in the first, it did not seem difficult when the time came to attempt the second. I did not understand that in a war the power of a civilian minister to carry through a plan or policy is greatly diminished. He cannot draw his strength year by year from Parliament. He cannot be sure of being allowed to finish what he has begun. The loyalties of peace are replaced by the jealous passions of war. The parliamentary safeguards are in abeyance. Explanation and debate may be impossible or may be denied. I learnt this later on. I shall show presently the difficulties into which these decisions to create a fast division of battleships and to rely upon oil led me into during the years 1913 and 1914. Nor can I deny that colleagues who could not foresee the extra expense which they involved had grounds of complaint. Battleships were at that time assumed to cost $2.25 million each. The Queen Elizabeth class of fast battleships cost over $3 million each. The expenditure of upwards of 10 millions was required to create the oil reserve, with its tanks and its tankers, though a proportion of this would have been needed in any case. On more than one occasion, I feared I should succumb. I had, however, the unfailing support of the Prime Minister. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, whose duty it was to be my most severe critic, was also my most friendly colleague. And so it all went through. Fortune rewarded the continuous and steadfast facing of these difficulties by the Board of Admiralty, and brought us a prize from fairyland far beyond our brightest hopes.
End of Chapter 6, Part 1.